email those directly to you?
Both, please,
Okay.
to all three of the teaching participants.
Okay, so the TA as well?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, they're both TAs. Whitney's not always here, but because she's teaching at the School of the Art Institute, but she's reading in an engaged way. Okay.
We've had several questions too about like, do students need to let anybody know about their plan for completing like the midterm and the final, or do they just need to have a
No.
plan? Okay.
Any more? Yeah? Do you have a hand up? No, okay. Any more logistical issues with, quick question.
Yes.
If we do streaming, what are you plugging into? Is that just a battery for?
Yeah, just
But
battery.
you're not connected to the internet or something?
No, no.
It's all, and so it goes wireless and it's immediately streamed and
Yes.
saved on YouTube
Yes.
at the end of today?
Yes.
Fantastic, okay.
At the end of the hour.
Okay, so if we get your app, we ought to be able to do that too.
Okay.
Because Antoine used to have a connection to a cable, but he didn't, I don't know, I didn't know what that was, but you're not doing it. Okay,
No.
but if it works that well, that fast, then you've got a better mousetrap. And we should try to follow. Let's see.
Oh, we don't have the lights right
Yeah,
there. Wait.
I hate to bother you.
No,
but-
not at all.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Why this section in the course on community power? Power is there for sure in lots of our continuing discussions. The front page of The Economist this week has a sketch of the President of China. And it says, the most powerful man in the world. Okay, how do they conceive or measure power? How do we all conceive or capture power? These are continuing questions in all fields, in terms of one family, in terms of your relationship to your roommate or your dancing partner, in terms of a class, in terms of a work team, in terms of nations, in terms of Trump versus other people, etc. And the main answers to what is power, how does it work, really come from the field of community power as it emerged after World War II and continues up to present, which are studies of cities. And the term community power came from Floyd Hunter, whose book used that title in 1953. But the issues are eternal, they go way back and they continue at present. The difference between, say, Aristotle and the front page of The Economist is, and in contrast to the community power field, is the community power field tried to say, what is power, how does it work, how can we put these pieces together as social scientists, not just have a cover, because for some purposes, the cover of, I mean, clearly, we don't have a systematic analysis which the Economist editorial writers use to try to say what is power. That is, how about Saddam Hussein or Stalin compared to the President of China today, or the President of China today compared to Mao? I mean, how you compare those and why are what we get into with these kinds of questions. Point one, power is there all the time, and people have talked about it loosely and more precisely. Second, the specific field of community power had a linkage within one main theory from Hunter up through Clarence Stone, which was, what was the main theory that held them together? Marxism, basically. And Marxism stressed capitalism, capitalists and corporations as being the key drivers of the political system. The substructure drove the superstructure. Everybody who knows Marx knows that. And so it was taken for granted by Hunter that, of course, the normal main leaders of a city are its business leaders. So he went out to try to measure this, and he did in a way that gave him what he and some others thought were the normal, quote-unquote, results. Normal if you follow a Marxist theory. But Clarence Stone restudied the same city, Atlanta, that is, Hunter studied it in 1953. Stone studied it again and again in the 80s, the 90s, and so forth. That's where he spent most of his career. But then, I read you at the beginning of the course, the first session, Stone's basic conclusion at his at the APSA session where we were together in Chicago about maybe 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, that I'm not bringing it up right. I'm not bringing it up right here, but the basic point was that perspective of business dominance, as I analyzed it and called it regimes, no longer is valid. And he didn't say maybe it never was as valued as you thought it was, but what we're getting is, at least in his case, and he said things like this over time, and I point to him as one of the key theorists of community power following up in this field in the last 20, 30 years. Most people in political science and sociology have people like Logan and Molich, who've never really, well, who have defined, who have articulated changes as well, who've said, you know, what we did, or Logan said basically, the growth machine theory is wrong. And it was wrong in the past, it's wrong at present, as we get better data, better case studies, and so forth. So he has one paper on case studies, one paper on comparative analysis. But the point is, this is happening around the world with people who've never heard of these particular names, with the decline of a Marxist business capitalist dominance kind of perspective. In part, it's happened after 1989 in the sense that we're all capitalists in some ways, but in another sense, we're all more governmentally oriented. Just to take one example, nonprofits. I did a book on nonprofits. The Sierra Club, churches, civic groups, and so forth. If you look at all of those in Asia, they were created in Asia to work under the government and to implement welfare state, hospital, helping the elderly, dealing with floods, a disaster, and they were expected to march in step, follow the sort of quasi-military style of the Japanese, Korean, or Chinese political leadership. Naturally. Doesn't have to be, it's not business. It's government dominance in that case. In the West, especially the U.S., England and the U.S., most explicitly, and then after 1789 and after the 19th century in France, the civic groups were there to monitor, criticize, and attack the state, to fight for independence, to fight for women of the world, or gays, or to advance egalitarian causes and to show corruption, to show malfeasance and so forth. Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, and the like. These groups, which had as their quintessential focus independence of authority, have in turn become primarily funded more than any other source today in the last 20 years. This is new. Funded by whom? Their national governments. So the Asians are moving toward the Europeans and the Americans. The Americans are moving toward the Asians in the sense that government and independent, that is, if we think of business, government, and civic groups as three kind of arenas, they're interpenetrating each other more than they ever did in the past, and so concepts and labels like capitalism or statism or party dominance do not have the kind of meaning which they did 50 years ago. Okay, that's the bigger background that Stone does not articulate, but within the US the same thing is happening as well in different ways, as we have more fragmentation, more, as we talk about in the 7 books on the New Political, we have more issue specificity. The arenas that Paul Peterson talks about are more segmented from one another, making it harder to generalize across these. Okay, so all this is going on around the world. This gets debated at the same time the political parties that were founded and which still encapsulate ideologies of the classic 19th century left and right, continuing in the US in what was called the New Deal, they still have pretty much their perspectives. But you then have people who break outside of them and who capture these new emerging configurations, who were in the past Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump. In the sense that there's issue-specific combinations of ideas that don't fit the way that the political parties have packaged them. In France, you have Macron is elected as president, who had no party. He came out of nowhere. He created his own party, and he defeated the main parties. In Italy, this happened earlier, when you had the 3 main parties after World War II are all basically dead. The Christian Democrats, Communists, and Socialists are all gone down. There are 20 parties today in Italy. In Germany, the 2 lead parties have gone down and down in the last elections most recently. And you have multiple new political parties and individuals that don't fit the normal category. So the point is, this is not one country, one time period, one short-term change. It's happening around the world in multiple ways. How to capture this, or that is how to get our hands on some of these specifics in the context of these changes. One thing which we can do in this course is to give you some specific dimensions of power in ways that you can think a little more coherently and a little more critically when you see something like the front page of Economist, which says, here's the most powerful man in the world. May be true, but it depends on how you want to conceive of power. What happened? Look, I want to go through a little bit of the. Oh, I see. Okay, I got a different set of notes here. One thing which we often do is go through four traditions leading into 4 conceptions of power. The first one on the far left, we'll put this up. Actually, I looked and I didn't have it in my UPA, but could someone take a look in the course readings, I think it is, or what are they called? Yeah. And see if you see it. Can you see a diagram there with which that is? I'll put it on the board, but I won't if you can also if it's right there. Called something like Power and 4 Dimensions, Dimensions of Community Power, and it has 4 columns, including Hunter, Dahl, and others. If you find that, please tell me, and then I won't bother to recreate it here for you.
find it?
Okay, let me start talking and we can go on with this. I'm going to skip the section on sort of the 50s and 60s, the emergence of this field. I mean, it's history, but it's not as big a point as some of the more contemporary things which I'm bringing in for you here. Max Weber. Some of you know about this essay on class status and power. Why did Weber write this essay? What was the dominant theory of power surrounding him, and how did he address it in this essay? You're almost ready to talk. Yeah, give us a reflection a little bit. Anything?
Well, I don't know, why did he write it? It's a really broad question, but like contextually, he was also studying directly after a major war, so was interested in power and mechanisms, generally speaking. But Might Makes Right was kind of the predominant understanding of power prior to his more detailed analysis.
But if you say might makes right, what is might and where does it come from?
Most simply, like, it was the ability to assert one's will over another, regardless of the will of the other person.
Okay,
That was like his overall definition of power.
that's more dull. I mean, that's partly there, but Weber was looser. I'd say let's not waste our time on definitions. Going back to Weber. The two or three big important points in the class status and party. One is that Weber then, as most people were through the early 20th century, let's say among intellectuals in the Parisian left bank, in American literature departments, and a few sociology departments, Marxism was the dominant view, which is to say the economic explained everything. Okay, so Weber's main counter was, no, that's too simple. So instead of saying you just have the economic substructure and superstructure, he said, we have three different pillars. The economic, the political, and the status or social. Class, status, and party. So class, explained, is a way of labeling the economic. Status is a way of differentiating, let's say, people who might be knights or come from an older family, and status in that sense could come from being a wrestling champion. That is, it comes from having some kind of expertise, doing something well. It could be bureaucratic status. You can be a high civil servant, even though your parents were low in income and education. You can rise in that kind of status is independent of the economy, is a simple big point. The third column then is party, which is politics. So politics may be built on the economy, it may be built on status, but each of these three are partially independent. He's making an early version of what we talk about as issue politics. These are three separate issue areas, arenas, sectors, and you can't reduce the one to the other because each is partially autonomous. The people who make steel in China are not the same people in the CCCP in Beijing. And the people who know how to make steel, or tried, need different tools and different expertise. The people who grow the rice are different from the people who paint the paintings and so forth. So there are different kinds of expertise in every country of the world, especially as economies, political systems, and status groups grow more differentiated, more complicated, You can't reduce the one to the other, and that's been going on for a long time. Okay, so Weber had Weber's big contribution, I would say, there is one, to say, look at the separate issues and don't try to conflate them into one single hierarchy. Whether it's caste, or the economy, or something else, or religion, or power. Power in the sense of politics. So in that sense, he might have challenged who was on the cover of The Economist. That's a political leader. Maybe he doesn't have economic power. He certainly does. But he has it through the political system. Whereas Trump is saying, elect me president because I have economic expertise. I know how to get rich. I know how to be a good businessman. And that's what we need more of in Washington. These people are incompetent dumbos. They don't know how to manage anything. Okay. So those are two competing perspectives on who has the legitimate right to govern and manage well. Okay. And they fought, okay, so people are fighting over these today, yes?
I was just wondering, in like the example of Trump, and I was also reading an article about Bernie Sanders and his relationship to like the Democratic Party. And I was wondering if like you could draw maybe the appeal to them in that the political system as it is now, like establishment, has like lowered in status in a way, like as Americans have become like less trusting of it. Like and Bernie Sanders is like, you have the quote that like Trump has like, you know, is like the money guy, but then Bernie Sanders raised it, you know, raised his money like door to door, and so like it showed. I think that's like also a good example of like how economics is a separate branch.
Yes, yes, yes. Good point, Saul.
But to the same degree, Trump also won by a status as opposed to anything else, because politically the people, his voter base doesn't necessarily benefit politically from his policies or stances, and so it's exclusively like a populist ideology that puts him in power. It's just like a complex idea of status. Like I feel like I'm not saying like the only reason was because like career politicians themselves are low. Like I'm not saying that's the only thing, but I feel like it's a contribution of like the fact that he had this like outsider like appeal to him, and that like he had status in like the populist like perspective, but. And I think I was just more like trying to compare like establishment versus non-establishment, and how like at one point politicians were maybe this, I mean they still have power, but.
I just think it's kind of interesting to compare Trump and Bernie in ways that are different, because something that I realized was their views on like trade deals.
If you can easily move, you want to aim it toward the person who's
I
talking.
wasn't sure, since we don't have photo releases, if we were allowed to.
Okay, okay.
But I have the audio.
Let's ask you orally. Do we have the permission of you to put you on the little video, so when you're not just a voice, but we can see your face?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Great.
Okay, all right, I'll take it.
Anybody, do we agree? Does anybody object? Okay, good. Does anybody want to? Okay. I was head of the Human Subjects Rights Commission, so we want to, for the social scientists, so we want to have you engaged. Okay. Okay, fine. Question?
Oh yeah, more than a question, just an observation, just because I kind of realized that Trump and Bernie Sanders, they have the same views on trade deals, in which they're against, you know, they're all for like protecting the American citizen. And as a result of that, I guess a lot of the same blue-collar workers that would have voted for Bernie Sanders also voted for Trump. So I just think it's interesting to like pit them against each other, but also realize that their economic policies on like not putting restriction on the economy are like quite similar. But yeah.
But they are similar in the sense that I'm talking about. Populist leaders look for issues and bring them to success by taking issues that the main parties have not addressed in a systematic way. So that the traditional Republican Party, which should have favored economic growth, lower taxes and the like, and free trade, he reversed the position of the Republicans on that main issue by saying, no, nationalism, and we want a wall, we want to keep out those Mexicans, and we do not want free trade because it's taking the jobs away from American workers. Okay, That putting together of pieces of ideology and appeal in ways that don't fit the normal pattern of the parties illustrates, as does Bernie Sanders, as do people from Mitterrand to Macron and so forth, that the traditional political parties don't capture the new combinations of issues. But as we have in the analysis of about 7 political science students here, and now we're going on to law schools, some have graduated, some are still in here. We have a version on Trump. And basically, our argument is that there are 5 different Trump scenes, and that each is different. And so rather than use the term there is the base or a Trump voter, there are many different disparate Trump voting scenes with different combinations of ideologies, such as the wall or nationalism or anti-immigrant. But 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. And they're not just, West Virginia unemployed coal workers. There are lots of people who voted for Trump for probably different reasons. That makes it more complicated than we often hear discussed. But it illustrates the more general point that political leaders and the dynamics we have today fit less well with party ideologies. And this is a bigger problem still if you're in the propaganda committee or the central committee of the CCCP, China, you've got to figure out what's our program going to be. And if it's a huge country and you've got all these disparate new views emerging, how do you create a program that's still a strong program because it's a strong party that people are supposed to follow? That creates a leadership problem for you. Yeah.
So from the Bavarian perspective then, as we're seeing like the decline in parties or the explanatory power of parties, like what is coming up in its place given, so like status seems to be like an operative for like ideology or issue politics that aren't party specific. Is that like correct understanding of status?
That's a good, that's a fine one-sentence statement of what we want to elaborate in the weeks to come. So we'll go into it more, but the general point is yes, but how and where and why and how much and the like is what we want to pursue a little further. Okay.
I think we have another question.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep you from your notes, but I was just curious, going back to the statement that now political leaders don't really fit their party ideology as much. Do you see this as more applicable to people like Trump who are running specifically for national office than people like Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell, or is that something that is there not as much of a difference?
The answer is the opposite depending on the country. That is, in most countries of the world, let's say Europe, Western Europe, England, the strong national party forces the mayors and the city councils to follow the national party program, or they're not slated. They don't get money, they don't get any volunteers. Non-volunteers, professionals to come out and ring doorbells and to help them. The U.S. is the opposite. This is a federal system where the local parties of mayors and council members, or especially in small towns, they don't need anybody's help. And they can go all over the place in their programs and what they propose. So at the local level, we have all kinds of people who are combining programs and have been doing that for all of U.S. history. But the U.S. is completely out of step with the West Europeans, or even more with China, where you have a strong party, and where in the past we had, that is, the European parties are getting weaker, and the same thing with the Chinese. The Chinese Communist Party is getting more and more federalist. It's delegating. It's more open. They invited us to do this report on the social organizations, the NGOs and so forth. in order to permit more access by average citizens. So that's happening all around the world, but at the same time, that's why that is because there's not one answer, more or less, to your question. It depends, and how and why it depends is what we want to elaborate with the propositions which we're moving to. Back up my quick answer to your question, but great to get the questions, and then we'll try to keep coming back to them. The other big point we want to add about Max Weber, in addition to the definition, the labeling of issue specificity as distinct from one hierarchy, is the idea of that there's not one cause. That is, politics is not caused only by economics. That is the simple story. Politics can be influenced by the economy, by status groups, but then if you then look more closely, what's business? Well, you can have cement companies. You can have art galleries. You can have retired military. These are very different kinds of economic interests. So it's not as if there's one economic interest. There are many, many, many little economic interests, just as status groups. You can have artists. You can have lawyers. You can have medical doctors. You can have religious leaders. Each of these are separate criteria for status, and they have different perspectives on how this might be articulated. And if you try as a political leader to respond to these, the more differentiation you have in your constituents, the harder it is. And if you try to do it through a political party where you have 5 or 500 or 5,000 members of the party, and you try to bring them along to say, yes, this is the position of the party, it's harder and harder, and so you've got all kinds of, and so in generally the way this happens, as illustrated by the West Europeans most visibly, and the U.S. election, is the older, well, same, pardon, say the French, the Italian, and the German cases are better illustrations of the older parties lose. They go down, and as they lose votes, as they go down and down, other new parties come in that are more successful. The strongest example was after 1989 in Poland. The Communist Party was out, and there were 200 political parties that campaigned in Poland. 200! There was a free sex party, a beer drinkers party, etc., etc. You know, all kinds of little groups. Okay, so issue politics, differentiation of issues, and multi-causality. Those are the big, big points to take away from that essay when you think now and in the future about power. If someone says power is, and you can say it's might, but you heard my follow-up question, what's might? It's like saying it's another word for power. Okay. The mainstream of the social sciences, political science, sociology, anthropology, parts of history, economics, geography, followed Max Weber in the early 20th century in the general sense of moving toward multi-causal analysis and away from one-factor theorizing. It also became more professionalized, seeking to find an analytical base for social science apart from ideology. This was the thesis of his second famous article that many of you know, Science as a Vocation. This was near World War I. Then came the Depression. There were many then in Germany through Weimar and in the U.S. after 1933, many who turned again to economic variables, and Marx was revived. Example, The Leading Community Study in America in the 1920s was a book by a minister sociologist and his wife, Robert and Helen Lind. The book was called Middletown. The town was Muncie, Indiana. It was a journalistic which sought to be comprehensive with chapters on religion, the family, schools, and so forth. It said little about politics. or class conflict, or power. Yet as the Depression grew deeper, the Linns, this is in the 20s, the Linns returned and wrote Middletown in Transition after 1933. And this book was very different. It was largely inspired by Marx and sought to argue from the first. Power was predominantly held by one large family, the X family, etc. The details, I mean, the story of Middletown is classic, simple, traditional ethnography, the writing style essentially journalism for the general reader, but the storyline of money and domination was clear. The book sold, and it was the book that made sort of community power visible for general Americans. And then this was continued in Hunter's 1953 book on Atlanta community power structure. He was a grad student here in SSA at the USC, later worked in Atlanta as a social worker, but he wanted to finish a PhD at the University of North Carolina. And his style was so lively, hard to pinpoint the theory. He later said, however, at a meeting where I was present, I was a Stalinist Marxist. So, quote unquote. What was new was not the theory, he was loose. I mean, Stalin would have been ashamed because Hunter was so messy. He had all kinds of ideas which contradicted it. You know, a real Stalinist would have edited his style into a coherent party program, not Hunter. What he said was loosely Marxist, but he also followed the elite theory of Pareto, Mosca, and others who were more sophisticated than Hunter. But the method, the so-called reputational method, was snowball sampling, circles, connecting lines, sociometry, rankings of leaders, who's powerful in Atlanta. Basic result, as I mentioned, business dominance by the elite, some professional leaders, some doctors. The politicians, however, were distinctly subordinate to them. Social and economic status were explained. Social and especially economic status explained politics. Substructure, superstructure was the argument, although these terms were not used. Okay, there were 166 studies of community power and leadership conducted in these years. Many were modeled on Hunter. They adopted his basic method, they applied it to another college town, but some not. And so we have on the reading list a couple of exceptions as well. Sayer and Kaufman is on the list as an example of a study that showed somewhat descriptively that there were many types of decision makers in New York City. The economics, simply put, did not dominate. Even the mayor did not dominate. No one dominated New York decision making. Banfield is similar on Chicago, but a better story in part since Daley and his machine were so widely seen as so dominating so much. He showed that Daley was not so powerful, that he tended to wait for a pluralistic fight to resolve itself in different neighborhoods, and then he leaned over toward the victors, held up the hand, and said, "The winner." Banfield's thick description is some of the best ever completed, inspired by the drama of Chicago, and will pursue some of his themes. But the big analytical split of Hunter from all of these earliers was Dahl. Robert Dahl, D-A-H-L. So, let me just briefly, oops. There's a little picture. Okay, here's my little picture. I'll put the headings up and you can fill them in yourself. 4 types. The traditional elitists, who are Pareto, Mosca, Seawright Mills later on, Hunter, 1953, Dahl, and then the comparative researchers later on, 1960s and onward, basically. And if we can then look at each of these for what did they say. They had a general concept. Here, this was a base resource. Here, I'll come back. This is power, this is influence, and this is all three. Base resources are things like money, control of the media, organizational leadership. And you could measure those because people like Pareto were doing this in 1890 when they did not have interview data, they didn't have variations and so forth. And so they tended to choose things where someone, historically, if you go back, as Pareto was talking about, I mean, any right-thinking Italian is always fascinated with why did the Roman Empire go down? Why are we no longer dominating the world? Okay, and so if you want to look at the decline of the Roman Empire, you can't do interviews. You've got to use things like who was in the council, who was the head. You know, what did Caesar do? You know, where was Caesar and how did Caesar relate to Mark Antony and so forth? Okay, so these are base resources that they would bring. Power was things like, and so here we get, so this is the concept, conceptual level. Power was loosely defined by Hunter as who's the most important person in Atlanta. Dahl started with the definition that you gave from Weber. In a sense, power is that which influence is you do something different because she's there. Because she's there, I say, I better not say that. So you have people change, person one changes because of person two. That's the old definition of power. And we'll critique that as we go ahead, but that's what informs Dahl. Okay, the comparative researchers, when I came into this field, there were Mike Aiken, John Walton, others who were starting to compare cities and say, you know, instead of saying one city is this way, if we compare Atlanta with New Haven, with other places, they differ. And why they differ may be important to understand how they work. So in that sense, the question here was, who rules? Here it's who's in the elite? What's the composition of this elite? Here it's who governs, and over here it's who governs where, when, and with what effects. That is, what are the policy outputs? So we're starting to build here a little version of what you saw a week or two ago. That is something like this. That is a more integrated systems model of the whole political system. Not just one question alone. Okay, the method here is what was generally called a positional. A position such as the head of the Roman Empire. Here it's the reputation. What do people say? Who's the most important? Who would you rank based on an interview? Here Dahl said, no, reputation can be merely words, empty. We want to see concrete decisions. We want to ask 5 questions, or let's say, over here, when we basically over here we said, let's use all these methods, and let's compare the results that we get when we do the position, the reputation, the decision, and then see how they complement each other and how that varies from city to city. So we had versions called the open-ended reputational, the closed-end reputational, and the decisional sorts of methods to capture these. And so, for instance, we'd find things like one city you could get the same, if you drew 3 circles, they all overlap. You get the same results, whatever the method, because the business, the political, and the economic may be the same people, the same interests, the same kinds of things. But in other cities, like New Haven, nobody's at the center of everything except the mayor. And everybody else these are very differentiated issue areas. So the degree of pluralism varies from city to city. That's the background informing this 4th perspective. And then the question is why, and what are the structural characteristics which lead these to vary? Okay. those are the, you can fill in more with the readings, but the point is, these things didn't evolve slowly and easily. People were fighting about them. And these concepts and the sharpness of these concepts came because of people were writing letters. For instance, I was just a young grad student, and I sent a paper, a draft paper, to a recent grad student of Dahl's named Nelson Polsby, and he replied, "Dear Mr. Clark, I think I should try and preserve a solemn tone in this letter because I confess your latest paper had some things that I found quite offensive. You characterize my work as critical of the concept of social stratification. From this I infer that you believe I'm against the very employment of the notion of social stratification in sociological analysis. Utter bunk. I am nowhere critical of the concept of social stratification. My work, you say, is written in a vindictive vein. This kind of remark may get you points up there for all I know, but if you intend to engage in scientific discussion, you'd be well advised to put up or shut up on something like this. I have yet to find the serious scientific or scholarly investigator who welcomes this sort of overarching and undemonstrated character assassination. You place this remark in a self-congratulatory rose garden of statements about how devastating you would be if you were not such a generous fella at heart. Unleash yourself, Chiang Kai-shek." Okay, that's the kind of, I never met him. I sent him a thoughtful, I said, "Could you give me advice on it? I'm just a grad student." Okay, that was the tone. All right, so out of this emerged new concepts. And they started with such things as saying, I'll just introduce one or two of the big ones. Okay, so Dahl, what are some of the most important concepts in Dahl? Decision making, the decisional approach, but beyond that, conceptually, issue areas coming from Max Weber. Resources. What are resources in Dahl and why are they important? Like the things I mentioned, money, control of the mass media, having people that are personal friends, a big family, those are resources, but the major point was to bring in that term. These are only resources. Back here, these people didn't think of these as resources. They said, this is power. This is might. Dahl said, these are only resources in the sense that maybe you don't use them. If you've got a big stick, you got your Bill Gates, you got billions of dollars in the bank or the stock market or whatever. If you don't spend it in the town where you live, and you're in Africa or wherever else, you may have zero impact in your local town. Okay, that's the big point. That where and why the resources get activated and how they're used, that's what Dahl is talking about. Okay. Related to that is the idea of pyramiding, that you can pyramid, if you build a coalition, say, with 5 different kinds of people with 5 different kinds of resources, money, control of the mass media, unions with lots of members who'll go out and march and ring doorbells, and then say some bankers with lots of cash. And if you have different combinations of